My name is Claire. I am 32 years old, and I work as a senior financial auditor at a top investment firm in Chicago. For years, I was the family workhorse, the invisible daughter who paid her own way while my parents funded my sister's luxurious lifestyle. But nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into a private dining room at a Michelin-starred restaurant holding an anniversary gift for my parents, only to hear my mother cheerfully toast to stealing my $12 million inheritance. They thought they had secured their future by selling my property behind my back. They had no idea I had already set a trap that would end with them in federal handcuffs. Before I share exactly how I destroyed their perfect crime, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe toxic family members deserve to face the consequences of their greed. It was a brisk Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago. The wind coming off Lake Michigan carried a sharp bite, but I hardly noticed it as I handed my coat to the hostess at the upscale restaurant. I was there to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. In my hands, I held a vintage bottle of Bordeaux, carefully selected and ridiculously expensive, a peace offering to maintain the fragile truce we called a family dynamic. I took a deep breath, smoothing the skirt of my tailored navy suit. As an auditor, my daily life revolves around uncovering discrepancies, finding the missing numbers, and exposing financial truths. But when it came to my family, I had spent my entire life pretending not to see the blatant favoritism. My parents, Harrison and Beatrice, operated our family like a highly exclusive country club where I was merely the staff. My younger sister, Savannah, was the VIP member. Savannah is 29, a social media influencer whose primary talent consists of spending money she does not have. Beside her is always Jamal, her 31-year-old husband. Jamal is a smooth-talking African-American man who pitches himself as a tech visionary. In reality, he is the CEO of a failing startup, drowning in debt, constantly relying on my parents to bail him out. I followed the hostess down the softly lit corridor toward the private dining rooms. The restaurant hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of the Chicago elite. I expected a standard, tense family dinner. I expected my mother to make passive-aggressive comments about my sensible shoes or my lack of a husband. I expected my father to boast about his latest golf game while picking up the tab to show off his wealth. I stepped into the doorway of the private room, ready to paste on my usual polite smile. But I froze before making my presence known. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see the four of them gathered around a pristine white tablecloth, adorned with crystal glasses and flickering candles. They were not just having a quiet anniversary dinner. They were celebrating. Really celebrating. My father Harrison sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with the kind of arrogant triumph I had not seen since his business was actually profitable years ago. My mother Beatrice was wearing a new diamond necklace that caught the candlelight. Savannah and Jamal sat close together looking at a digital tablet and laughing with unrestrained glee. It looked like a victory lap, and I was the only one not invited to the starting line. I tightened my grip on the wine bottle, a sudden sense of dread curling in my stomach. The property. It was the only thing of real value left in our family orbit, and it belonged entirely to me. When my grandparents passed away, they completely bypassed my father. They knew Harrison was obsessed with maintaining a wealthy facade and would squander everything to keep up appearances. They knew Beatrice would funnel every dime to Savannah. So they left their prime commercial real estate in the heart of the city exclusively to me. It was a massive building valued at $12 million, a generational safety net that I had carefully managed for years. My parents had always deeply resented this. They viewed my inheritance as a clerical error, a cosmic mistake that temporarily placed their rightful money into my unworthy hands. As I stood hidden in the shadows of the corridor, my mother picked up her champagne flute. She tapped the crystal edge with her manicured fingernail, demanding the table's attention. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the room. I held my breath. Beatrice stood up, a radiant, triumphant smile stretching across her face. "I raise my glass to your father," she announced, her voice dripping with satisfaction. To the man who finally stepped up and took control of what was rightfully ours. To our family for finally liquidating that dead weight property and putting it to actual good use. I felt the floor drop beneath me, but I could not look away. Jamal raised his glass high, a wide, greedy grin on his face. And to my startup, he cheered loudly. Cheers to securing our $12 million funding. We are going to be untouchable now. Savannah clapped her hands together, practically bouncing in her seat. I cannot believe we finally did it. Malibu, here we come. No more begging Claire for scraps. The pieces clicked together with sickening speed, liquidating that dead weight property. $12 million. They were talking about my building, my inheritance, my grandparents' legacy. They were sitting in a Michelin-starred restaurant drinking expensive champagne, toasting to the fact that they had somehow sold my commercial real estate right out from under me. They were celebrating funding Jamal's sinking ship of a company with my $12 million. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. A normal person might have dropped the wine bottle. A normal person might have burst into the room screaming, demanding answers, throwing glasses and crying tears of profound betrayal. But I am an auditor. I deal in facts ledgers and cold, hard reality. The shock lasted only a fraction of a second. It was immediately replaced by a surge of icy, calculating adrenaline. I pushed the heavy oak door completely open and stepped into the light, letting the door click shut behind me. The sound was sharp and final. 4 heads snapped in my direction. The celebratory smiles froze on their faces, quickly replaced by varying shades of guilt and absolute defiance. The war had officially begun. The silence in the private dining room was absolute. The only sound was the faint jazz music drifting through the thick walls from the main restaurant and the gentle hiss of the ventilation system overhead. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply walked forward, my heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet, and set the vintage bottle of Bordeaux exactly in the center of the pristine white tablecloth. The heavy glass hit the wood underneath with a dull, authoritative thud. For a long moment, nobody moved. Savannah stared at me with her mouth slightly open, her fingers gripping her champagne flute so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Jamal looked away suddenly, very interested in the fabric of his expensive tailored suit. My mother Beatrice pressed her lips into a thin line, the triumphant glow on her face instantly hardening into a mask of defensive irritation. But my father Harrison was a different breed entirely. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, placed the glass down, and adjusted his silk cuffs. He looked at me not as a daughter he had just betrayed, but as a minor logistical hurdle in a corporate merger. "Have a seat, Claire," Harrison said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth or guilt. "There is no need to stand there hovering. We were actually going to call you tomorrow morning to discuss the restructuring of the family assets." Restructuring. That was the word he chose. I remained standing, my eyes locked on his. "You sold the commercial property on Michigan Avenue," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "The property that Grandpa and Grandma left solely in my name. The property you have absolutely zero legal right to touch." Harrison sighed, a patronizing sound that echoed with years of dismissed boundaries. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke jacket and retrieved a crisp white envelope. He tossed it onto the table. It slid smoothly across the linen, stopping right next to the anniversary wine I had brought them. "Open it," he commanded. I picked up the envelope and pulled out the piece of paper inside. It was a cashier's check made out to me, drawn from Harrison's personal account. I read the numbers printed across the center. $100,000. I stared at the sum, my auditor brain automatically calculating the math. $100,000 was exactly 0.83% of the property's $12 million valuation. He had stolen my entire financial future and was throwing me a fraction of a percent as a consolation prize. "What is this?" I asked, dropping the check back onto the table as if it were contaminated. "That is your cut," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. Consider it a massive return on an asset you did absolutely nothing to earn. You should be thanking me, Claire. I took a stagnant, complicated piece of real estate and turned it into liquid capital for the entire family. How? The word came out of my mouth sharp and precise. A title transfer requires the owner's signature in front of a notary. I did not sign anything. I did not authorize a listing. So tell me, Dad, how exactly did you bypass state real estate laws to sell a $12 million building that you do not own? Harrison did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He smiled a cold, calculating grin that made my stomach churn. The power of attorney, he said simply. It took me a second to process his words, and when I did, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. 4 years ago, I had been rushed to the emergency room for an unexpected appendectomy. There were complications, and before they put me under general anesthesia, the hospital advised me to sign a temporary medical and financial power of attorney just in case something went wrong. I assigned it to my parents because despite our flaws, I thought they would protect me. I survived the surgery, recovered, and completely forgot about the document. I assumed it had expired or been destroyed. You used a 4-year-old emergency power of attorney from when I was lying on a hospital bed to sign away my property, I asked, keeping my voice terrifyingly level. It was a perfectly valid legal document, Harrison countered, waving his hand as if brushing away a fly. I kept a certified copy in my safe. When the opportunity presented itself, I exercised my legal right as your designated agent. We found an anonymous corporate buyer, a group called Horizon Holdings. They offered $12 million in pure cash. No messy inspections, no financing delays. They wanted the title immediately, and I signed it over to them on your behalf. The funds cleared into my offshore accounts this afternoon. The deal is done, Claire. I looked at my mother. Beatrice was sitting taller now, bolstered by my father's arrogance. You stole from your own daughter, I said, shifting my gaze to her. Do not use that ugly word. Beatrice snapped, her eyes flashing with indignation. Nobody stole anything. We reallocated family resources. That building was wasted on you. You sit in a cubicle all day auditing other people's money. You are just an employee, Claire. You have a safe little salary and a retirement plan. You do not need $12 million sitting in a brick-and-mortar building. Harrison nodded in agreement, leaning forward to deliver his ultimate justification. Your mother is right. You lack vision. You are a worker bee, Claire. You manage risk, you do not take it. But this family needs capital to grow. Jamal's tech startup is on the verge of revolutionizing the industry, but he was facing a cash flow problem. The banks were being entirely unreasonable with their lending terms. As the patriarch of this family, I had to make the hard choice. I liquidated your idle asset to fund Jamal's venture. I looked over at Jamal. My brother-in-law was leaning back, twirling his champagne flute, looking incredibly pleased with himself. His company had been bleeding money for 2 years. He was known for renting luxury cars to look successful on social media while dodging calls from creditors. And my father had just handed him $12 million of my money. We needed the runway, Claire. Jamal chimed in, his tone entirely condescending. You have to spend money to make money. When we go public next year, I will make sure you get a nice little dividend. Think of this as an involuntary investment in the family's future. I stared at the four of them, letting the silence stretch. They were entirely convinced of their own righteousness. They had taken a medical emergency document, forged a path through a title company, sold my inheritance to a faceless corporation called Horizon Holdings, and funneled the cash into their own pockets. They thought I was just a naive, helpless employee who would take the $100,000 and walk away quietly. They thought I was too weak to fight back against my own blood. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. I remained perfectly still, letting the oppressive silence stretch across the private dining room. I did not scream. I did not reach across the table to slap the smug smiles off their faces. Instead, I engaged the very skill that made me exceptional at my job. I audited them. I audited their posture, their micro-expressions, the desperate greed radiating from their pores. I cataloged the way my mother nervously touched her new diamond necklace, a physical manifestation of guilt masquerading as wealth. I noted how my father avoided making direct eye contact with me, choosing instead to focus on the crystal wine glass in his hand. He was a coward hiding behind the legal jargon of avoided power. But the most revealing behavior came from the two people who stood to gain the most from my financial ruin. Savannah and Jamal were practically vibrating with unearned triumph. Savannah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the pristine white tablecloth. She looked at me with an expression of profound pity, the kind of manufactured sympathy she usually reserved for her social media apology videos. "Claire, stop looking so miserable," Savannah said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "This is a good thing for everyone. You were never going to do anything interesting with that property anyway. You do not even like real estate. You like spreadsheets." I kept my face perfectly neutral, offering no reaction. My lack of emotion seemed to agitate her, pushing her to justify her theft even louder. "Do you know how stressful my life has been lately?" she continued, gesturing wildly with her champagne flute. "My brand deals have been stagnating because I do not have the right backdrop for my content. We have been stuck in that cramped penthouse and my followers are getting bored. The Malibu house is an absolute necessity for my career. Jamal and I are building an empire requiring the right optics. You sitting on a $12 million building while your own sister struggles to maintain her brand engagement was incredibly selfish." She actually believed her own delusion. In her mind, my inheritance was an unjust barrier to her inevitable stardom. She genuinely thought that my grandparents leaving me that commercial property was a direct attack on her lifestyle. "You are 32 and completely single," Savannah added, tilting her head with a condescending pout. "What do you even need that kind of money for? You rent a basic apartment near your office. You buy clothes off the rack. You have zero aesthetic vision. Jamal and I will inject this capital into the economy. We are creating jobs. We are creating culture. You should be proud to be the silent investor in our success story." I shifted my gaze to Jamal. He took his cue, adjusting his posture to adopt the persona of a visionary tech mogul holding a press conference. He reached across the table, attempting to place his hand over mine in a gesture of fake solidarity. I pulled my hand away smoothly, letting his fingers land awkwardly on the bare linen. He chuckled, a low, arrogant sound, completely unbothered by my rejection. "Look at the big picture," Claire, Jamal said, using corporate buzzwords I hated. "You are too zoomed in on the details. You are looking at a piece of paper and a technicality. I am looking at the future of digital infrastructure. My company is one major cash injection away from dominating the market. We had venture capitalists begging to get in on the ground floor, but Harrison and I agreed that we should keep this wealth inside the family. We did you a massive favor by letting your dead asset fund my Series A round." I blinked slowly, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He was acting as if stealing my property was an exclusive investment opportunity I should be grateful for. "When we go public next year," Jamal continued, his voice rising, "the valuation is going to skyrocket. I am not just going to pay back the initial $12 million, I am going to pay you back double. That is $24 million, Claire. You could never generate that kind of return auditing tax returns for a living. Let us be brutally honest here. You make what, maybe $150,000 a year. You sit in a cubicle crunching numbers for men who actually take risks. You are a glorified human calculator. You would have to work for 100 lifetimes to see the kind of money I am going to hand you when my company rings the bell at the New York Stock Exchange." I looked down at the $100,000 check resting on the table. It was a pathetic bribe designed to keep me quiet while they lived out their fantasies on my dime. His arrogance was suffocating, but it was also incredibly useful. They were laying all their cards on the table, confessing their motives, their greed, and their utter contempt for me. They viewed my steady, lucrative career as a joke simply because it did not come with a red carpet and a dedicated public relations team. They thought my silence was submission. They assumed my lack of tears meant I was resigned to my fate, broken by the overwhelming force of their collective betrayal. They interpreted my calculated observation as defeat. They had spent their entire lives underestimating my intelligence, assuming that because I did not flash my wealth or post my achievements online, I was somehow inferior to them. As Jamal continued to brag about his non-existent future billions, and Savannah polished off her champagne with a satisfied smirk, I silently memorized every single word. I let them gloat. I let them paint their masterpiece of delusion, knowing that every arrogant syllable they uttered would make their impending collapse that much more devastating. Let them enjoy their stolen victory tonight, because tomorrow their entire world would burn to the ground, leaving only ashes behind. My mother, misinterpreting my unbroken silence as a crack in my resolve, leaned forward to deliver the final psychological blow. Beatrice always operated like a battlefield surgeon, finding the most vulnerable wound and digging her fingers directly into it. If Jamal and Savannah were the blunt instruments of my family's greed, my mother was the poisoned scalpel. She rested her hands on the table, the diamonds at her wrists catching the ambient light, and fixed me with a stare that demanded absolute submission. "You have to understand how wrong the original arrangement was," Beatrice said, adopting a tone of gentle maternal correction. "Your grandparents were not thinking clearly at the end. They were confused, Claire. We all saw the signs of mental decline, even if we were too polite to say it out loud at the time. Leaving a commercial property to a 22-year-old girl who had just graduated college was an act of senility. They were losing their minds. That property was meant for your father. It was his birthright as their son. You just happened to be standing there acting like the perfect compliant little granddaughter while they were vulnerable." The gaslighting was breathtaking. My grandparents were the sharpest people I had ever known. My grandfather was trading stocks on his tablet until the week he passed away. My grandmother did her own taxes until she was 85. They left the property to me precisely because they possessed total mental clarity. They saw exactly who Harrison was. They watched him hemorrhage his inherited wealth on bad investments, country club dues, and keeping up appearances. They knew if they left the building to him, he would leverage it into oblivion within a decade. They gave it to me because I was the only person in this bloodline who respected the value of a dollar. But Beatrice was not finished rewriting history. She scoffed, waving a hand in the air. "We are simply correcting a historical mistake," she continued. "You have always held this inheritance over our heads, acting so superior because you had a safety net. But what have you actually contributed to this family? You have hoarded wealth while your own sister struggled. We practically had to force you to buy dinner at the holidays. You are incredibly selfish, Claire. You always have been." The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me laugh. I was the financial workhorse of this family. I spent 4 years in university, working double shifts at a campus library and a local accounting firm just to cover my tuition. I graduated with heavy student loan debt, which I aggressively paid off by eating instant noodles and living in a basement apartment with 3 roommates. I never asked them for a single dime. I never expected a handout. Meanwhile, the family poured every available resource into Savannah, the ultimate golden child. When Savannah barely managed to graduate with a degree in communications, my parents rewarded her academic mediocrity with a brand new Porsche. They paid her rent for a luxury downtown loft so she could pursue her dream of taking photos of avocado toast. Every time Savannah maxed out a credit card, Harrison quietly paid it off to protect her credit score. My parents funded her entire existence, masking their blatant favoritism under the guise of supporting her creative journey. And then there was Jamal. My mother dared to call me selfish, completely ignoring the fact that Harrison had been secretly bailing out Jamal's failing tech company for the past 3 years. As an auditor, I knew how to follow a paper trail. I had seen the shell corporations my father set up to funnel cash into Jamal's business accounts. Harrison had burned through his own retirement savings, desperately trying to artificially inflate Jamal's startup so the family could maintain the illusion of having a brilliant tech visionary in the ranks. They were running out of secret funds, which was exactly why they needed the $12 million from my property. They were bankrupting themselves to fund a fantasy, and they expected me to happily finance their delusions. "You owe us," Harrison interjected, his voice booming across the table to reinforce my mother's attack. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We gave you the foundation to even get that precious auditing job of yours. You think you did all of this on your own? You are a product of this family. Everything you have belongs to us by right. We are merely taking our rightful share. The coordinated psychological attack was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. They surrounded me, each taking a turn to batter down my reality. Savannah chimed in, rolling her eyes in dramatic exasperation. You are making this so difficult, Claire. Why do you always have to ruin every family event? Mom and Dad are just trying to make sure everyone is taken care of. If you actually cared about anyone but yourself, you would have offered to sell the building years ago to help my husband. You are just bitter because Jamal and I are actually building a legacy while you are going to grow old alone with your spreadsheets. They were trying to break me. They wanted me to doubt my own memories, to feel guilty for being responsible, to believe that their blatant theft was actually a noble act of family preservation. They wanted me to look at the check and feel grateful that they had allowed me to keep even a fraction of my own money. They expected me to crumble under the weight of their collective disapproval, to apologize for being selfish, and to quietly accept my role as the sacrificial lamb for Savannah's happiness and Jamal's ego. I looked at the four of them, analyzing the desperate greed hiding beneath their arrogant posturing. Their gaslighting was a pathetic confession of their weakness, which fortified my resolve without a single ounce of mercy. When my continued silence offered them absolutely nothing to push against, the dynamic in the room shifted. Savannah, sensing that Harrison's booming authority and our mother's sharp reprimands were failing to extract a reaction, immediately changed her tactics. I watched her posture deflate. The aggressive, entitled influencer vanished instantly, replaced by a fragile, misunderstood victim. Her lower lip began to tremble on command. It was a performance I had witnessed 1,000 times throughout our childhood, refined now to an absolute art form. She reached for her linen napkin, pressing it delicately against the corners of her perfectly made-up eyes to catch tears that did not actually exist. Claire, why do you always make me feel like I am a terrible person? Savannah asked, her voice cracking with a manufactured vulnerability that made my skin crawl. I am just trying to build a life. Jamal and I are trying to create a future, and you are sitting there looking at us like we are criminals. We are family. Family is supposed to help each other build a legacy. She paused to emit a jagged theatrical sigh. Jamal instantly wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. He shot me a look of profound disappointment, playing the role of the noble husband forced to witness his wife being emotionally battered by a cruel, unfeeling sister. We want to have children, Claire. Savannah continued, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. We are trying to start a family. Do you have any idea how much pressure Jamal is under? He is working day and night to get his startup off the ground so he can provide for his future children. We need that Malibu house. We need a safe, beautiful environment to raise a family in. We cannot bring children into a cramped downtown loft. The public schools in our current district are completely unacceptable. We are just trying to secure a foundation for your future nieces and nephews. How can you sit there and judge us for wanting to be good parents? You are supposed to be their aunt. You are supposed to want the best for them. Instead, you want to hoard all of Grandpa and Grandma's money in a dusty old commercial building just to spite me. The sheer absurdity of invoking unborn children to justify a $12 million real estate heist was staggering, but Savannah was just getting started. She dropped the napkin, letting her tear-filled eyes lock onto mine. Let us be entirely honest, Claire. What do you even need that money for? She asked, her voice gaining a sharp, accusatory edge beneath the weeping. You are single, you have no children, you have no husband to support, you do not even date. You go to work, you go to the gym, and you go back to your quiet, lonely apartment. You have absolutely zero expenses compared to what Jamal and I are facing. You do not have to maintain a public image. You do not have to network with investors. Your life is entirely self-contained. Why do you need $12 million to buy more pantsuits? To upgrade to a slightly nicer cubicle? It is completely selfish of you to keep that kind of wealth locked away when it could literally change the trajectory of my entire life. Savannah sniffled, leaning heavily into Jamal's embrace. It is just so unfair, she whimpered, addressing our parents now instead of me, ensuring her audience was fully captivated. I put myself out there every single day. I share my life with millions of followers. I build communities. Jamal is creating technology that will change the world. We have massive overhead costs just to exist in our circles. We have to attend charity galas. We have to host networking dinners. We have to travel to maintain our brand partnerships. Claire just does not understand the immense financial pressure of being visible. She gets to hide in the shadows. It is easy for her to sit on a pile of money because she does not actually participate in the real world. Beatrice immediately swooped in to validate Savannah's fabricated distress. My mother reached across the table, covering Savannah's trembling hand with her own. "Oh, sweetheart, please do not cry," Beatrice murmured, shooting me a glare of absolute venom. "You are upsetting your sister Claire. Look at what you are doing to her. She is already under so much stress with the move and the company, and you are sitting there like a block of ice." Harrison nodded solemnly, adjusting his tie. "Your sister is speaking from the heart, Claire. She is talking about the future of the bloodline. You have always been terribly short-sighted about these things. We are talking about generational wealth. We are talking about setting up Jamal and Savannah's children for absolute success. You are being completely self-centered by focusing on a piece of paper with your name on it, instead of looking at the profound good this money is doing for the people you are supposed to love." Jamal tightened his grip on Savannah, looking at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. "We did not want to do it this way, Claire. We really did not. But you left us no choice. Every time we brought up leveraging the property in the past, you shut us down. You refused to listen to reason. You forced Harrison to take executive action because your stubbornness was literally suffocating my company. You put your own ego above the survival of my business and the happiness of your sister. You made yourself the villain of this family long before we signed that title over to Horizon Holdings. We just finalized the paperwork. You were too spiteful to sign yourself." The sheer magnitude of their narcissistic echo chamber was a marvel of human psychology. They had expertly inverted reality. In their twisted narrative, I was the malicious hoarder actively trying to destroy my unborn nieces and nephews by keeping my own legal property, while they were the brave, visionary victims who were forced to commit real estate fraud just to survive. They fed off each other's delusions, validating every toxic thought, until their theft sounded like an act of profound moral courage. I sat motionless, absorbing every single accusation, every fake tear, and every manipulation. They thought they were breaking my spirit, burying me under a mountain of engineered guilt. They thought if they shamed me enough about my single status, my quiet lifestyle, and my lack of children, I would simply fold and accept the $100,000 bribe just to buy back their affection. They truly believed I was desperate for their validation. They were entirely wrong. Harrison watched me for a long moment, scanning my face for any sign of a fracture. Finding none, he decided it was time to drop the hammer. He pushed his chair back slightly, adopting the posture of a reigning monarch delivering a final edict to a vanquished peasant. He wanted to eradicate any lingering flicker of hope I might harbor. He wanted me to know that fighting back was not just difficult, it was an absolute mathematical impossibility. Claire let us dispense with the emotional theatrics. Harrison began, his voice dropping into a resonant, commanding register. He dismissed Savannah's fake tears with a wave of his hand, signaling that the time for hard business facts had arrived. "You understand numbers, risk, and leverage, so I'm going to explain your leverage to you right now. You have none. Absolutely zero." He picked up his wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid with practiced ease. "The transaction closed at precisely 2 o'clock this afternoon. The moment the escrow officer stamped the final deed, $12 million was released by Horizon Holdings. By 2:15, those funds hit my primary corporate account. By 3 o'clock, I initiated a series of cascading wire transfers. The money is already gone." He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, invading my physical space with sheer arrogance. "It was routed through a holding company in Delaware, bounced to a corporate trust in the British Virgin Islands, and is currently resting safely in an offshore account in the Caymans that you will never be able to subpoena. The money is entirely insulated from the United States legal system forever. You cannot freeze what you cannot find." I kept my expression perfectly vacant, letting him bask in his own perceived genius. And do not even think about contesting the title transfer. Harrison continued, a cruel smile playing on his lips. I used the power of attorney. The title company accepted it. The notary certified it. The county clerk recorded it. As far as the state of Illinois is concerned, I acted as your legal agent in a standard commercial real estate transaction. The paperwork is completely bulletproof. We used top-tier real estate brokers. They looked at the documents, approved the sale, and closed the escrow without a single red flag. The building belongs to Horizon Holdings now. There is no legal mechanism on earth that will reverse that sale. Jamal snickered from his side of the table. You got outplayed, Claire. Just take the loss with some dignity. Harrison ignored Jamal, keeping his predatory gaze fixed entirely on me. Let us talk about the buyer, Claire. Let us talk about Horizon Holdings. Do you know who they are? Because I do. They are a massive, faceless corporate conglomerate. They buy up commercial real estate across the country, bulldoze the weak, and build empires. They have billions of dollars in liquid assets and an entire floor of corporate litigators whose only job is to crush nuisance lawsuits from people exactly like you. He tapped his index finger against the white linen tablecloth, punctuating each word. If you try to sue them to get that building back, they will bury you. They will file motion after motion, bleeding you dry with legal fees. A senior litigator at their retained law firm charges $1,000 an hour. You would bankrupt yourself before you even made it to a deposition. They will drag this out until you are living on the street, and then they will countersue you for frivolous litigation. You are a single auditor going up against a corporate titan. You are an ant trying to stop a freight train. Beatrice nodded along, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Your father is trying to protect you from yourself, Claire. You have always been so stubborn. If you try to fight this, you will lose everything. We are offering you a clean break. Harrison slid the check an inch closer to me. The paper scraped softly against the table. I am giving you a gift, Claire. I am giving you $100,000 of clean, untraceable cash. You can walk out of this restaurant tonight, deposit that check tomorrow morning, and go back to your quiet, safe little life. You can pretend none of this ever happened. All you have to do is accept reality. He leaned back again, crossing his arms over his chest. I hold the money. The corporation holds the building. The county holds the deed. You hold absolutely nothing. You have been completely outmaneuvered, Claire. It is over. The air in the private dining room felt heavy, suffocating under the weight of their collective delusion. They sat there convinced they had engineered the perfect crime. Harrison believed his offshore accounts made him untouchable. Jamal believed the stolen capital would transform him into a tech billionaire. Savannah believed she was moments away from picking out custom countertops for a Malibu mansion. Beatrice believed she had finally put her disobedient, independent daughter in her proper place. They looked at me with varying expressions of pity, contempt, and triumph. They waited for the inevitable breakdown. They waited for the moment my shoulders would sag, my eyes would well up with defeated tears, and my trembling hand would reach out to take the check. They expected me to surrender to the inescapable reality of their complete control. They had constructed a flawless, impenetrable fortress of fraud, and they were utterly certain I was trapped outside its walls. I looked at the check sitting on the crisp tablecloth. I looked at Harrison's smug face. I looked at Beatrice's diamond necklace purchased with the anticipation of my stolen wealth. They thought they had backed me into a dark corner with no exits. They thought I was a helpless victim who had simply been outplayed by superior business minds. They were all completely oblivious to the fact that they were already dead. Looking at my father's smug expression, my mind seamlessly drifted away from the ambient noise of the restaurant and slipped backward in time. 2 years ago, I was 30 years old, sitting alone in my modest downtown apartment on a freezing November night. The wind was howling off the lake, rattling the glass panes, but the chill that settled into my bones had nothing to do with the Chicago winter. It came from a single piece of misdirected mail resting on my kitchen island. As a senior auditor, my daily routine involved tracking anomalies. My brain was hardwired to notice when numbers did not align, when paperwork seemed out of sequence, and when corporate entities tried to hide their sins behind layers of bureaucratic red tape. That particular evening, I had opened an envelope from a notoriously aggressive hard money lending firm. It was a standard verification of identity letter, an automated compliance notice generated because someone had applied for a massive commercial mortgage against my $12 million property on Michigan Avenue. I had never applied for a mortgage. The building was owned outright, entirely free and clear, a rare and beautiful asset passed down from grandparents who understood the unparalleled power of unencumbered real estate. I logged into the county clerk's digital portal, my fingers flying across the keyboard with clinical precision. Within 10 minutes, I pulled the preliminary application documents that had been filed to initiate the loan. There at the bottom of the disclosure agreement was my father's signature. Below his name was the legal justification for his authorization. He had submitted a copy of the emergency medical power of attorney I had signed before going under the knife for my appendectomy 4 years prior. I stared at the glowing blue screen of my laptop until my eyes burned. The reality of what I was looking at defied all bounds of basic human decency. My own parents were secretly trying to leverage my inheritance. They were attempting to extract an $8 million loan against a property they did not own, using a medical emergency document they had hoarded for years. If the lender had approved that mortgage, the cash would have immediately vanished into Harrison's offshore accounts, funding Savannah's lavish lifestyle and propping up Jamal's catastrophic tech startup. Meanwhile, the legal obligation to repay that massive debt would have fallen entirely on me. When the monthly payments inevitably defaulted, the bank would have foreclosed on my building, seizing my grandparents' legacy, completely bankrupting me in the process. My own blood was willing to destroy my financial future to fund their delusions of grandeur. In that quiet, isolated moment in my apartment, something fundamental inside me snapped. The illusion of family loyalty, the ingrained societal expectation that parents inherently protect their children, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I realized that my father did not view me as a daughter. I was merely an obstacle guarding a vault of cash. My mother did not care about my well-being. She only cared about maintaining the extravagant illusion she projected to her socialite friends. A weaker person might have picked up the phone right then and there. A different daughter might have called her parents screaming through tears, demanding to know how they could commit such an atrocious act of betrayal. She might have threatened to call the police or begged them to stop. But I knew exactly who Harrison and Beatrice were. If I confronted them, they would gaslight me. They would claim it was a misunderstanding, a simple financial restructuring strategy they were exploring for my own benefit. They would withdraw the application, apologize with empty words, and then they would quietly retreat into the shadows to find a stealthier, more destructive way to steal my property. Confronting a narcissist only teaches them to become a better liar. I realized that evening that protecting myself was no longer enough. Defense was a losing strategy against predators who shared your DNA and knew your vulnerabilities. I needed to go on the offensive. I needed to sever their access to my life with surgical precision, but I also needed to ensure they would never dare to target me again. I had to let them think they were winning. I had to let them walk right into their own trap. The sheer malice of their attempted mortgage scheme demanded a response that went beyond mere preservation. It demanded absolute, devastating retribution. I closed my laptop that night and made a silent vow. I would not shed a single tear over people who viewed my existence as a financial inconvenience. Instead, I would use the very skills they mocked to engineer their downfall. They thought my job was boring. They thought auditing was the domain of human calculators who lacked the vision to take real risks. They vastly underestimated the terrifying power of someone who knows how to follow the money, manipulate the system, and execute a plan without letting emotion cloud her judgment. That freezing November night was the catalyst. It was the exact moment I stopped being their compliant daughter and started being their executioner. The next morning, I did not call the police and I did not call my parents. I went to work, requested a personal day, and began the process of interviewing legal counsel. I knew that fighting white-collar criminals required a specialist, someone who understood the dark arts of asset protection and commercial real estate law. As I sat in the restaurant 2 years later, looking at my father's smug, victorious face across the dining table, the memory of that night fueled the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. He was so incredibly proud of his power of attorney. He was so certain that his secretive planning had caught me completely off guard. He had no concept of the fact that I had been watching him for 24 months, anticipating his every move, calculating his exact level of greed, and carefully paving the road that led directly to this private dining room. The absolute arrogance required to steal $12 million is blinding. Harrison looked at me like a master chess player who had just executed a flawless checkmate. He thought his offshore accounts and his corporate buyers provided an impenetrable shield, but his arrogance was his fatal flaw. He assumed that because I remained quiet, I remained ignorant. He mistook my patience for passivity. I let the memory of that cold apartment fade away, bringing my focus entirely back to the present. The restaurant air smelled of expensive wine and roasted meats. The faint, triumphant smile on Savannah's face was still there, completely undisturbed by any notion of consequence. Jamal was still sipping his champagne, dreaming of his Silicon Valley debut. My mother was adjusting her new diamond necklace, the physical prize of her betrayal. They had spent the last 2 years plotting a theft that I had seen coming from miles away. They had walked blindly into a maze I had meticulously designed, and now the gates were locked behind them. The morning after I intercepted that hard money lending application, I walked into the downtown offices of a law firm notorious for crushing corporate adversaries. I did not need a family mediator or a friendly neighborhood attorney. I needed a mercenary. I needed someone who viewed familial ties as irrelevant data points in a broader financial equation. That was how I found Oliver. Oliver was 45 years old, a senior partner specializing exclusively in trust law and commercial real estate litigation. He was a man who spoke in sharp economic sentences and wore suits that cost more than my parents' mortgage payments. When I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and handed him the fraudulent loan application bearing my father's signature alongside my old medical power of attorney, Oliver did not express sympathy. He did not offer empty platitudes about how difficult family betrayal must be. Instead, he smiled. It was a cold, surgical smile that told me I had found exactly the right weapon. "Your father is playing a very dangerous, very stupid game," Oliver said, sliding the documents back across the desk. "He is relying on a temporary 4-year-old medical directive to execute a high-leverage commercial transaction. A lazy title company or a greedy hard money lender might push this through if they do not look too closely. But legally, it is incredibly fragile. The problem, Claire, is that as long as the property sits in your individual name, you are a target. If we revoke the power of attorney today, they will just find another loophole tomorrow. They will forge your signature, or they will try to declare you legally incompetent. Narcissists do not stop when they hit a wall. They just look for a softer spot to break through." I leaned forward, clasping my hands together to stop them from shaking. "Then how do I make myself bulletproof?" I asked. "How do I build a wall they cannot climb over, dig under, or break through?" Oliver steepled his fingers, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute intensity. "We remove you from the equation entirely," he explained. "We do not fight the power of attorney. We render it legally obsolete. We are going to take your $12 million commercial building and transfer the deed into an irrevocable trust." He stood up and walked over to a whiteboard on the wall, grabbing a black marker. He drew a quick diagram outlining the legal fortress he was about to construct around my life. "Right now, Claire owns the building," he said, tapping the board. "Harrison holds a piece of paper that says he can act on behalf of Claire. But if we execute an irrevocable trust, Claire no longer owns the building. The trust owns the building, and the power of attorney your father possesses only gives him the right to act on behalf of you as an individual. It grants him absolutely zero authority to act on behalf of a trust." The genius of the strategy washed over me. It was clean, brutal, and utterly impenetrable. By transferring the asset into a trust, the property would effectively cease to exist in my personal financial portfolio. I would be named the sole beneficiary and the sole managing trustee. I would retain absolute control over the revenue, the leasing agreements, and the management of the property. But on paper, in the eyes of the law and any title company performing due diligence, the building would belong to an entirely separate legal entity. If your father tries to sell or mortgage the property after the trust is recorded, Oliver continued, tossing the marker aside, he will be committing a federal crime. He will be attempting to sell an asset that does not belong to the person named on his power of attorney. It turns a shady family dispute into a cut-and-dry case of title fraud and wire fraud. It is the ultimate legal shield. It does not just stop the theft, it weaponizes the attempt. I did not hesitate. I authorized Oliver to draft the paperwork immediately. We spent the next 2 weeks working in absolute secrecy. I provided all the original deeds, the tax records, and the appraisal documents my grandparents had left me. Oliver and his team drafted an airtight, irrevocable trust agreement, layering it with complex asset protection clauses that would make it impossible for anyone to pierce the corporate veil. We named it the Chicago Heritage Trust, a subtle nod to the future I was securing for myself. The execution of the documents took place in a windowless conference room at Oliver's firm. I sat at a long glass table surrounded by notaries and legal clerks signing my name dozens of times. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lifting off my shoulders. I was effectively severing my financial umbilical cord from the toxic bloodline that had tried to drain me dry. The deed was legally transferred. The county clerk recorded the new ownership. The shield was officially raised. Oliver poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, sliding one across the table to me after the notaries left the room. "It is done," he said, raising his glass in a quiet toast. "You are now the trustee of a $12 million fortress. Your father's power of attorney is now nothing more than a dangerous liability. If he ever tries to use it to move that property, he will be signing his own arrest warrant." We knew we could not simply tell Harrison that the property had been shielded. If we warned him, he would adapt his strategy. He would abandon the real estate scheme and find another way to ruin me. He might try to hack my personal bank accounts or steal my identity to open credit lines for Jamal's business, utilizing the countless pieces of personal data he had collected over the course of my entire life. The only way to permanently neutralize the ongoing threat was to let him proceed with his original, disastrous plan. We had to let his unbridled greed blind him to the harsh legal reality of what he was actually doing. We had to deliberately, meticulously step back into the shadows, wait quietly for the perfect moment, and allow him to walk straight into the inescapable jaws of our expertly engineered trap. It was the only guarantee I had for achieving permanent, absolute peace. To guarantee that peace, I had to transform myself from a passive victim into an active architect of their ruin. The irrevocable trust was a flawless shield, but a shield alone does not win a war. I needed a weapon, and the most lethal weapon against Harrison and Beatrice was their own insatiable greed. I returned to Oliver's office a month later with a new objective. We needed to dangle a piece of raw meat in front of starving wolves. I asked him to connect me with an appraiser who understood discretion. We drafted a realistic but speculative valuation report. We factored in a fabricated yet plausible municipal zoning change that would allow for a massive tech hub development on my lot. The fake appraisal validated the $12 million price tag and heavily implied that corporate buyers were scouting the block, willing to pay premium cash before the news went public. I could not just hand this document to my father. Harrison was paranoid and would immediately suspect a setup. I had to let him steal the information, making him believe he possessed a secret advantage. The opportunity arrived during Thanksgiving. It was one of the rare occasions I subjected myself to the family estate, enduring Savannah's boasting and Jamal's empty entrepreneurial pitches. I brought my work tote intentionally, leaving it unzipped on the console table in my father's home office, while I supposedly went to help my mother in the kitchen. Inside that tote, sitting right on top, was a manila folder boldly labeled Confidential Valuation Estimate. I stayed in the kitchen for exactly 15 minutes chopping vegetables and ignoring my mother's passive-aggressive comments. When I returned to the office, the folder was exactly where I left it. However, the precise alignment of the papers inside, a detail an auditor never misses, had shifted by a fraction of an inch. Harrison had found it. He had read it. The venomous seed was planted. Over the next 2 years, the psychological shift in my family was a fascinating and repulsive sociological study. They suddenly began treating me with a strained, artificial kindness. Savannah texted me links to luxury vacation packages, hinting that we should take a sister trip. Beatrice casually asked if I was feeling overwhelmed by the burden of property management, offering to have my father take a look at the books to ease my stress. Jamal began dropping heavy-handed hints about how commercial real estate was a stagnant market and how digital equity was the only way to build true generational wealth. They were circling the perimeter, testing the fences, trying to gauge how easily I could be manipulated into signing the building over voluntarily. I played my part flawlessly. I complained about rising property taxes. I feigned ignorance about shifting market trends in downtown Chicago. I acted like a timid, overwhelmed employee who was completely out of her depth managing a multi-million-dollar asset. I gave them every indication that I was ripe for the picking while simultaneously refusing every single offer they made to help me manage the property. I forced them into a corner. I made them believe that if they did not take aggressive, immediate action, I would carelessly squander the massive windfall they felt entitled to. 18 months into my waiting game, Oliver called me on a secure line. The county clerk's office had recorded a quiet title inquiry against my address. Someone was running background checks on the deed, verifying there were no liens or encumbrances. A month later, another alert triggered. A corporate broker had requested a digital copy of the property boundaries. Harrison had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. He was actively shopping the building to private buyers, using his fraudulent power of attorney as his golden ticket. The restraint it took to sit back and watch them orchestrate a felony against me was staggering. Every time I sat across from them at a family dinner, smiling politely, while they secretly plotted to destroy my financial existence, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. They thought they were the masterminds of the century. They thought they were outsmarting the boring, predictable auditor. They had no idea they were simply acting out the exact script I had written for them. I waited in the shadows for 2 entire years, letting their arrogance inflate until it reached the point of no return. I let them secure their buyer. I let them negotiate the price. I let them pop the champagne. The harsh clinking of silverware against fine china pulled me abruptly out of the past and back into the present moment. The memory of Oliver's office and that freezing November night dissolved, replaced entirely by the warm amber glow of the Michelin-starred private dining room. The smell of roasted duck and expensive truffle oil filled my lungs. I blinked my vision, refocusing on the scene unfolding directly in front of me. Savannah was still dabbing at her dry eyes with the linen napkin, waiting for my sympathy. Jamal was still leaning back in his chair, exuding the unearned confidence of a man who thought he secured $12 million of venture capital. Beatrice was still clutching her new diamond necklace, her eyes narrowed in a predatory glare. And Harrison was still sitting at the head of the table, his hand resting casually near the cashier's check he had slid across the wood to me. The $100,000 insult was sitting right there, a physical manifestation of their complete moral bankruptcy. They were all staring at me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown, waiting for the moment of total capitulation. They expected me to fold. They expected me to surrender. Instead, I let a slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face, signaling the end of my silence. My smile did not waver. If anything, it deepened, reaching my eyes in a way that finally seemed to unsettle the manufactured peace of the room. I watched the microscopic shift in my father's posture. Harrison was an expert at reading boardrooms, but he had never truly bothered to read his own daughter. He interpreted my calm demeanor not as a threat, but as the final stage of grief. He thought my smile was a fractured response from a broken mind, the defensive mechanism of an auditor who had finally realized she was hopelessly outmatched. He cleared his throat, a sharp, authoritative sound designed to snap me out of my supposed shock. Harrison reached back into his tailored jacket, sliding his hand into the inner breast pocket a second time. I knew exactly what was coming. White-collar criminals never leave loose ends, especially when those loose ends share their DNA. He pulled out a thick legal-sized document bound by a heavy black clip. He tossed it onto the table with the same dismissive arrogance he had used for the cashier's check. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud right next to the $100,000 bribe. "This is the final piece of business we need to conclude tonight," Harrison said, tapping his index finger firmly against the top page. "It is a standard non-disclosure agreement combined with a comprehensive waiver of liability. I had my corporate attorneys draft it specifically for this transaction. It is airtight, Claire." I glanced down at the document. Even upside down, I could read the bold, capitalized headings. Waiver of right to sue. Covenant not to compete. Absolute confidentiality clause. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation designed to gag me for the rest of my natural life. "Let me be perfectly clear about your options," Harrison continued, leaning over the table, so his face was entirely in my line of sight. "Option 1 is very simple. You pick up that pen, you sign your name on the dotted line, and you take the $100,000. You walk out of here as a wealthy woman. You get to stay in this family. You get to come to Thanksgiving dinners. You get to be an aunt to Savannah's future children. You accept your place, you keep your mouth permanently shut about the sale of the building, and we all move forward in perfect harmony." He paused, letting the illusion of family inclusion hang in the air like a poisoned carrot. Then his expression hardened, the fatherly facade dropping completely to reveal the ruthless corporate predator underneath. "Option 2 is equally simple," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You refuse to sign. You try to play the hero. You try to hire a discount lawyer to challenge a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. If you choose option 2, the $100,000 check evaporates immediately. You will never see a single dime of that money. Furthermore, you will be entirely excised from this family. You will be dead to us, Claire." I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. "You are threatening to disown me over a building you stole," I stated, keeping my tone strictly observational. "I am giving you a reality check," Harrison shot back. "If you fight this, you will face absolute destruction. I will personally ensure that every resource at my disposal is used to bury you in legal fees. Horizon Holdings has an army of litigators who will drag you through depositions until you are completely bankrupt. You will lose your apartment. You will burn through your pathetic savings. You will spend the next decade fighting a war you cannot possibly win, and you will do it entirely alone." I slowly reached out and pulled the thick document toward me. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of his towering arrogance. I flipped to the second page, scanning the densely packed legal jargon. The terms were draconian. Not only was I forbidden from discussing the property sale with anyone, including legal counsel, but the agreement also contained a staggering penalty clause. If I violated the NDA, I would be liable for $5 million in liquidated damages. He was trying to force me to sign away my constitutional right to legal recourse under the threat of financial annihilation. It was a brilliant strategy for intimidating a civilian. To anyone else, the sheer scale of the legal threats and the intimidating corporate language would induce total paralysis. A normal person would look at the immense pressure, look at the $100,000 check, and realize that submission was the only logical path to survival. They would sign the paper, take the bribe, and spend the rest of their lives swallowing the bitter pill of defeat. But as my eyes scanned the paragraphs noting the boilerplate language and the standard corporate indemnification clauses, all I saw was a desperate attempt to cover a fatal mistake. If his power of attorney was truly as bulletproof as he claimed, he would not need a waiver of liability. If Horizon Holdings was truly a massive, unassailable conglomerate, they would not care if a single auditor threatened to sue them. The very existence of this NDA was a glaring neon sign pointing directly to my father's underlying vulnerability. He knew his legal standing was fragile. He needed my signature tonight because my signature was the only thing that could retroactively legitimize his federal crime. "You need to understand the magnitude of the gift your father is giving you," Beatrice chimed in, her voice slicing through my internal analysis. She gestured toward the check with her wineglass. We could have given you nothing, Claire. We legally owe you nothing. But Harrison insisted on taking care of you. You are being completely ungrateful by even hesitating. I flipped to the signature page. There was a neat line printed with my full legal name waiting for my submission. Next to it was a designated space for a public notary. I noted the absence of a notary in the private dining room, a minor logistical error on his part, but one that further highlighted his rushing the process. He wanted to lock me in tonight, bind me with fear, and finalize the paperwork before I had a chance to consult with an actual attorney. Sign the document. Claire Harrison demanded, his patience visibly wearing thin. Sign it. Take your money and let us order dessert. We have real things to celebrate tonight, and I am not going to let your typical stubbornness ruin our evening. We have given you the roadmap to survival. I suggest you take it before I rescind the offer completely. I ran my fingertip along the edge of the paper, feeling the sharp cut of the high-quality stock. I looked from the draconian contract to the cashier's check, weighing the visual props of his blackmail scheme. He had laid out two distinct options, both designed to ensure his absolute victory and my total subjugation. He demanded I trade my silence for a fraction of my own stolen wealth. It was the ultimate, inescapable ultimatum presented by a man who was utterly convinced he held all the cards. I let the silence hang in the air for a fraction too long. I did not reach for the gold-plated pen resting beside the document. I did not flinch. I simply kept my eyes locked on the signature line of the non-disclosure agreement, analyzing the profound desperation masquerading as authority. Harrison let out a sharp breath of irritation, shifting his weight in his chair. He was accustomed to people crumbling the moment he raised his voice. My refusal to immediately capitulate was disrupting his carefully choreographed timeline. Before Harrison could launch into another tirade about corporate litigation, my mother decided it was time to deploy her own arsenal. Beatrice possessed a uniquely vicious talent for psychological warfare. While Harrison relied on brute financial force and legal threats, my mother understood that true destruction required a more personal touch. She knew exactly what I valued most in the world. She knew that my career was not just a job to me. It was my sanctuary. It was the foundation of my independence, the only thing I had built entirely on my own, free from the toxic reach of their influence. Beatrice folded her hands neatly on the table, the diamonds on her fingers flashing in the dim restaurant lighting. She tilted her head, fixing me with a stare so devoid of maternal affection it could have frozen water. "Claire, let us not pretend you have any high ground here," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a smooth conversational rhythm that was infinitely more terrifying than a scream. "Your father is offering you the corporate reality. But I think you need to understand the social and professional reality of what happens if you refuse to sign that document tonight." I shifted my gaze from the contract to her face, giving her my full attention. She smiled, a razor-thin curving of her lips that signaled she was about to go for the jugular. "You take great pride in your little auditing career, do you not?" Beatrice asked rhetorically. "You think your position at that firm makes you untouchable. You think because you wear a badge and carry a briefcase into a glass building downtown, you are somehow elevated above the rest of us. But you seem to have forgotten how this city actually operates. Chicago is a very big city, Claire, but the financial sector is a very small, very intimate club." She leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I sit on the board of the Symphony Guild. I chair the annual gala for the Children's Hospital. I spend my weekends at the country club sipping mimosas with the wives of the most powerful men in this state. Do you know who else sits on those boards? Do you know who plays golf with your father every Sunday?" I knew exactly who she was talking about. Richard Vance. Beatrice continued, dropping the name of the senior managing partner at my auditing firm. "And William Sterling, the head of your compliance division. I had lunch with Richard's wife just last Tuesday. They are lovely people, very protective of their firm's reputation." The threat materialized in the air between us, heavy and toxic. She was not just threatening to disown me. She was threatening to annihilate my professional existence. "An auditor has nothing without her reputation," Beatrice said, her words calculated to strike maximum terror. "Your entire career relies on absolute integrity, and unshakable ethics. If a client cannot trust you, you are worthless to your firm. So imagine what Richard Vance would do if I called him tomorrow morning in tears. Imagine if a prominent wealthy socialite called the senior partner of his prestigious firm to report a deeply disturbing family matter. I kept my face perfectly still, letting her lay out the exact parameters of her extortion scheme. I would tell him that my daughter has become mentally unstable. Beatrice mused, her eyes gleaming with malice. I would tell him that you have been attempting to mismanage family trust accounts, that you have been exhibiting erratic behavior, and that you are trying to extort money from your own sister's husband. I would express my profound concern that someone in such a fragile, greedy state of mind is handling sensitive financial data for his top-tier clients. Savannah let out a short, mean laugh, clearly enjoying the viciousness of our mother's strategy. Jamal grinned, taking another sip of his champagne. They were watching a public execution and loving every second of it. "How long do you think you would keep your job?" Claire Beatrice asked, driving the final nail into the coffin. A firm like that does not take chances. They do not wait for an investigation to conclude. If there is even a whisper of ethical misconduct, if there is even a shadow of a doubt regarding your integrity, they will fire you before lunchtime. They will escort you out of the building with your belongings in a cardboard box. She reached across the table and tapped her fingernail against the $100,000 check. "And it will not stop there," she promised. "I will make sure every major financial institution in Chicago hears about your sudden, tragic ethical collapse. I will ruin your name. Your CPA license will be flagged. You will be blacklisted across the entire Midwest. You will never work in finance again. You will lose your apartment. You will lose your precious independence. And you will end up working the register at a discount retail store." Beatrice leaned back, completely satisfied with the horrific picture she had painted. The sheer darkness of her threat was staggering. She was willing to completely destroy her own daughter's life, to fabricate a career-ending ethics complaint, simply to protect a stolen $12 million asset that she planned to funnel into Malibu mansions and failing tech startups. She was weaponizing her high society connections to commit blatant extortion. "Sign the paper," Claire Beatrice commanded, her voice hardened with absolute authority. "Take the check. Walk away. Because if you force my hand, I will strip you of everything you have ever worked for, and I will not lose a single second of sleep over it." The dining room fell silent again, the weight of her blackmail pressing down on the table. Harrison looked incredibly pleased with his wife's intervention. He saw her threat as the perfect complementary force to his legal intimidation. Together, they had presented an inescapable vice: legal ruin on one side, professional annihilation on the other. They thought they had backed me into a corner so dark and so deep that signing the non-disclosure agreement was my only path to survival. I looked at my mother. I looked at the cold, dead certainty in her eyes. She fully believed she held the power to destroy me. She fully believed that my fear of losing my job would override my desire for justice. She thought she was holding a loaded gun to my head. In my mind, my internal auditor simply opened a new ledger. Harrison had just committed title fraud and wire fraud. Now Beatrice had officially added criminal extortion and blackmail to the family tab. They were writing their own indictments paragraph by paragraph right in front of me. They thought my silence was the silence of a broken, terrified woman. They did not realize it was the silence of a predator watching its prey step directly into the center of a lethal, inescapable trap. The heavy silence that followed Beatrice's vicious threat was suddenly shattered by a loud, obnoxious clap. Jamal leaned back in his chair, a massive, self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. He interpreted my quiet observation as total crushing defeat. In his mind, my mother had just delivered the final fatal blow, and the war was officially over. The tension bled out of his shoulders, replaced instantly by the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had just conquered the world using someone else's bank account. "Look, everyone needs to just relax," Jamal said, his voice dripping with unearned authority. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and reached into his pocket. "We are sitting in a five-star restaurant. We just executed a massive corporate transaction. This is not a funeral. This is a celebration. Claire is going to sign the paper, take her $100,000 and be fine. Let us focus on the real victory here." He pulled out his smartphone, the screen illuminating his smug features in the dim lighting of the private dining room. He tapped the glass a few times, swiping through an application before slamming the phone face up onto the pristine white tablecloth. He pushed it directly across the table toward me, stopping it right next to the extortionate non-disclosure agreement and the pathetic cashier's check. "Take a look at that," Claire Jamal commanded, gesturing toward the glowing screen. I cast my eyes downward without moving my head. The screen displayed a high-resolution professional real estate listing. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern mansion perched precariously on a cliffside overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The architecture was aggressive and ostentatious, all sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, and stark white concrete. It looked like the villain's lair in a spy movie. "That is Malibu," Jamal declared, leaning forward to make sure I was absorbing every pixel of his stolen trophy. 8 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, a private screening room, and an infinity pool that drops right off into the ocean skyline. The listing price was just under $10 million. But in this market, you have to move fast. You have to be aggressive. Savannah let out a high-pitched squeal of delight, abandoning her fake victim persona entirely. She leaned over to look at the screen, even though she had undoubtedly memorized every photo already. "I am already talking to an interior designer in Beverly Hills," she announced to the table, her eyes wide with greedy excitement. "The kitchen needs to be completely gutted. The marble is the wrong shade of white for my brand aesthetic. And we are converting the entire south wing into a dedicated content creation studio. My engagement metrics are going to explode when I do the house tour video." Jamal nodded, validating her absurd priorities. "Exactly. It is a business expense. But the best part is how we secured it." He turned his attention back to me, his eyes gleaming with malicious pride. "I did not mess around with banks, Claire. I did not wait for financing approvals. The second Harrison confirmed the $12 million wire transfer from Horizon Holdings hit his offshore account this afternoon. I made the call." He paused, clearly waiting for a dramatic drumroll that was never going to come. "I wired a non-refundable $2 million cash deposit directly to the seller's escrow account in California just an hour before we sat down for this dinner," Jamal bragged, puffing out his chest. "Cash is king, Claire. When you drop $2 million in liquid cash on the table, sellers stop looking at other offers. We locked it down. The house is ours. The tech startup gets the rest of the capital, and we instantly elevate our entire corporate lifestyle. That is how real players operate." My internal auditor immediately cataloged the sheer staggering magnitude of his stupidity. He had not just spent stolen money. He had wired a massive non-refundable cash deposit across state lines into a heavily regulated California escrow account. He had created an indelible flashing neon paper trail leading directly from my father's fraudulent transaction to his own personal real estate acquisition. By bragging about the timing, he had just confessed to the immediate intentional dissipation of stolen assets. He had effectively cemented his role as a primary co-conspirator in a federal wire fraud scheme. Harrison beamed with absolute paternal pride, completely oblivious to the legal suicide his son-in-law had just committed. "That is a brilliant business move, Jamal," my father praised, raising his wine glass in a salute. "You identified a prime asset, you leveraged available capital, and you executed the acquisition flawlessly. That is the kind of aggressive vision this family has been lacking for years. It really is wonderful to finally have a real man taking charge of our financial trajectory." Beatrice chimed in, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. She smoothed the front of her designer dress, practically glowing with satisfaction. Someone who actually understands how to navigate the world, instead of just hiding behind a desk, crunching numbers for other people. The waiter entered the private dining room at that exact moment, carrying a fresh bottle of vintage champagne chilling in a silver bucket. Harrison waved him over immediately. "Pour it," my father instructed the waiter, his voice booming with jovial authority. "Fill them all to the brim. We are celebrating tonight." The waiter moved silently around the table, filling the crystal flutes with bubbling gold liquid. Savannah and Jamal were scrolling through more photos of the Malibu mansion on Jamal's phone, loudly debating whether to import Italian tile or Spanish marble for the master bathroom. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in their heads, completely intoxicated by the illusion of their stolen wealth. When the waiter bowed and quietly exited the room, Harrison picked up his freshly poured flute. He stood up from his chair at the head of the table, commanding the room's attention one more time. Beatrice, Savannah, and Jamal eagerly grabbed their glasses and stood up to join him. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap, observing the spectacle. To Vision, Harrison announced, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. To recognizing an opportunity and having the courage to seize it. To Jamal and Savannah's new estate in Malibu, and to the absolute success of the family business. And to Claire, Savannah added with a vicious, mocking smile, raising her glass in my direction. Thank you so much for your involuntary sacrifice. We literally could not have done this without you. Jamal chuckled a low, arrogant sound. Cheers to the ultimate silent partner, he mocked, winking at me. Drink up, Claire. Do not be a sore loser. The four of them brought their crystal flutes together in the center of the table. The sharp, clear, ringing sound of the glass chimed like a victory bell. They threw their heads back and drank the expensive champagne, swallowing their guilt along with the liquor. They stood there bathed in the warm light of the chandelier, a picture-perfect tableau of high society success. They were toasting to a real estate empire built on a foundation of forgery, theft, and extortion. They were celebrating their own absolute brilliance, thoroughly convinced they had executed the perfect crime. I let the crisp, effervescent sound of their celebratory toast fade into the heavy fabric of the soundproof walls. They lowered their crystal flutes, their faces flushed with the intoxicating warmth of stolen wealth and expensive alcohol. Harrison wiped a drop of champagne from his lower lip, looking incredibly satisfied. Beatrice admired her reflection in the blade of a silver butter knife. Savannah leaned her head against Jamal's shoulder, already whispering about which luxury car they should purchase first to match the aesthetic of their new Malibu driveway. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my lap, my breathing steady and measured. I needed to be absolutely certain. I needed to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the nuclear option I was about to deploy was entirely justified. I needed them to confirm that there was no salvageable humanity left in this bloodline. Does anyone here feel even an ounce of regret for doing this to me? I asked. My voice was quiet, completely stripped of any anger or accusation. It was a simple, flat inquiry delivered with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. But the question cut through the festive atmosphere of the private dining room like a blade. Harrison stopped wiping his mouth. He looked at me, his brow furrowing for a fraction of a second, before a loud, booming laugh erupted from his chest. It was a genuine laugh, deep and resonant, completely devoid of irony or guilt. He set his empty champagne flute down on the table and shook his head, looking at me as if I had just told the most amusing, naive joke he had ever heard. Regret. Harrison chuckled, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. Claire, you are looking at this entire situation through the lens of a sentimental child. Business is an ecosystem, and in an ecosystem, capital must flow to the apex predators. Why on earth would I regret executing a flawless financial maneuver that secures the legacy of this family? Regret is a useless emotion. Regret is for people who make mistakes, for people who fail to seize opportunities. I took a stagnant piece of real estate and transformed it into a global technology venture and a prime coastal asset. I do not feel regret. I feel an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. I am proud of what I did today. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table. You should be taking notes, Claire. This is how the real world operates. The weak get eaten and the strong build empires. I simply did what had to be done. Beatrice let out a long, theatrical sigh, rolling her eyes toward the crystal chandelier hanging above us. She reached up to adjust her diamond necklace again, a gesture of profound irritation. Please, Claire, stop being so exhausting, my mother said, her voice dripping with sheer exasperation. You are always trying to drag everyone down into your miserable little emotional vortex. You are 32 years old. You need to stop acting like a wounded victim just because your father made an executive decision. Do you know how tiring it is to constantly deal with your negativity? We are sitting here trying to have a lovely anniversary dinner, trying to include you in a massive family victory, and you are trying to ruin the atmosphere with these pathetic guilt trips. Beatrice picked up her fork, inspecting the polished silver with feigned disinterest. No one regrets anything, she stated with chilling finality. We did exactly what any responsible parents would do. We took an asset that was being hoarded by an ungrateful single woman and reallocated it to the children who actually have a future to build. If anything, you should be apologizing to us for being so stubborn that we had to take matters into our own hands. You forced our hand, Claire. This is entirely your fault. Savannah scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest and glaring at me with absolute contempt. She abandoned the fragile victim persona she had tried to wear earlier, fully embracing her natural, entitled cruelty. You seriously need to stop being so dramatic, Savannah sneered. It is actually embarrassing. You are sitting there acting like we burned your house down and left you to die in the street. You have a job, you have your little apartment, you have everything you need. You are just furious because you are not the center of attention. You always make everything about you, Claire. For once in your life, can you just be happy for me? Jamal and I are about to launch a massive tech company. We are moving to Malibu. We are starting a family. And you are sitting there whining about regret. Grow up. Jamal nodded in agreement, leaning back and resting his hands on his stomach. He looked at me with the cold, calculating gaze of a man who firmly believed he was infinitely smarter than everyone else in the room. It is just business, Claire. Jamal added smoothly, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. There is no room for feelings in high-level finance. You had an asset you were not properly utilizing. We found a way to leverage it for maximum return. It is capitalism in its purest form. You got $100,000 for doing absolutely nothing. You should be writing us a thank you note, not asking us to apologize. Just sign the non-disclosure agreement, take your check, and let us enjoy the rest of our champagne in peace. I looked at the four of them, committing their faces to memory. I recorded every word, every eye roll, every arrogant smirk. I had given them one final unspoken opportunity to show a single shred of remorse. If Harrison had hesitated, if Beatrice had looked away in shame, if Savannah had shown even a flicker of guilt, I might have felt a tiny fraction of hesitation about the devastating trap I was about to spring. But they gave me exactly what I needed. They gave me total unapologetic malice. They confirmed that they viewed my destruction not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a righteous, brilliant victory. They did not just steal from me, they believed they were inherently entitled to do so, and they despised me for daring to question their authority. The internal ledger was finally closed. The audit was complete. They had meticulously dug their own graves with every arrogant word they spoke, cementing the absolute fact that they deserved zero mercy. My conscience was perfectly clear, lighter than it had been in years. The heavy burden of familial obligation evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and exhilarating focus. I looked at the extortionate non-disclosure agreement resting on the table. I looked at the $100,000 bribe designed to buy my permanent silence. Then I looked at my father, letting the silence stretch until the air in the room grew tight and suffocating. The time for observation was officially over. It was time to execute the final maneuver. Section 14, 1,000 words. I reached forward. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the trembling hesitation they had been waiting for. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the heavy legal document containing the non-disclosure agreement. Right next to it sat the cashier's check for $100,000, the insulting fraction of my own wealth they expected me to swallow. I did not pick them up. I did not look at the signature line again. Instead, I applied a steady, even pressure and pushed both pieces of paper across the smooth linen tablecloth. They slid past the crystal water goblets, past the silverware, and slipped right off the edge of the table. The thick document hit the floor with a dull thud. The check fluttered down beside it, landing face down in the shadows. Harrison's jaw dropped. The booming laugh that had just been echoing off the walls died instantly in his throat. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if I had just slapped her across the face. Savannah and Jamal stared at the floor where their leverage now lay discarded, unable to comprehend the sheer defiance of the gesture. You actually think you hold all the cards? I said, my voice echoing with absolute crystalline calm. You have spent this entire evening congratulating yourselves on executing the perfect crime. You mapped out my psychological profile, assuming my silence was submission, and my lack of a husband made me an easy target. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen. I had pre-drafted a message to a very specific contact an hour before I even walked into this restaurant. The message consisted of a single word. Now. I pressed send. I placed the phone face down on the table right where their extortion paperwork had been sitting. What exactly do you think you are doing? Harrison growled, his face flushing with a sudden volatile anger. He placed both hands on the table, preparing to push himself up and physically intimidate me. Do you think sending a text message is going to save you, Claire? Did you text your little accountant friends to come rescue you? Let me remind you that I have $12 million in offshore accounts, and you have absolutely nothing. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. You are making a terrible mistake, Claire. Pick up that contract right now. You are embarrassing yourself and you are testing my patience. We are not playing games with you anymore. Jamal scoffed, shaking his head. She is probably calling an Uber because she knows she just blew her only chance at a payout. Let her go, Harrison. Let her walk out into the cold. We do not need her signature anyway. The title is already transferred. Savannah crossed her arms, rolling her eyes. Good riddance. Do not expect an invitation to Malibu. They did not get the chance to say another word. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room did not just open. They swung inward with a synchronized, authoritative force that completely sucked the air out of the room. The ambient jazz music from the main restaurant corridor briefly flooded in before the figures stepping through the threshold blocked the light. 3 men entered the room, moving with the kind of absolute, undeniable purpose that immediately commands silence. Leading the group was Oliver. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that made Harrison's expensive jacket look like a cheap imitation. His silver hair was perfectly swept back, and his expression was a mask of cold, predatory anticipation. He carried a thick leather briefcase, gripping the handle with relaxed, supreme confidence. But it was the 2 men flanking him that caused the temperature in the dining room to plummet to freezing. They were not wearing tailored suits. They wore dark functional windbreakers. Clipped to their belts, catching the dim light of the crystal chandelier, were the unmistakable gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were federal agents specifically assigned to the white-collar crime division, and their eyes scanned the room with professional, detached calculation, instantly locking onto Harrison and Jamal. The room's transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The celebratory warmth of the anniversary dinner evaporated, replaced by the sterile, suffocating reality of a federal sting operation. The clinking of glasses and the arrogant boasts were extinguished. Harrison froze, his hands still gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning a stark, translucent white. He looked from Oliver to the FBI agents, his brain desperately trying to process the impossibility of the scene unfolding before him. Beatrice dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her china plate, the only sound piercing the deafening silence. Savannah shrank back into her chair, instinctively pulling away from Jamal, as if his sudden proximity had become dangerous. Jamal himself looked like he had stopped breathing entirely. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed stare of pure terror. They had expected a weeping daughter, a defeated auditor, or perhaps a weak, desperate threat of a civil lawsuit that they could easily crush with corporate attorneys. They had absolutely never expected the federal government to walk through the door of their victory party. Oliver stepped forward, stopping precisely at the head of the table opposite my father. He placed his heavy leather briefcase onto the pristine white linen right next to my phone. He popped the brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the silent room. "Good evening, Harrison," Oliver said, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with lethal professional courtesy. My name is Oliver. I represent Claire as her lead counsel for trust and commercial real estate litigation. And unfortunately for you, we are not here to negotiate a settlement today. We are here today to officially dismantle every single pathetic illusion of control you thought you had over my client. Oliver did not wait for an invitation. He stepped right up to the edge of the dining table, positioning himself directly across from my father. The two FBI agents fanned out slightly behind him, their presence a silent, terrifying promise of what was about to happen. Oliver popped the brass latches on his heavy leather briefcase, the sharp metallic clicks echoing in the stunned silence of the room. He reached inside and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents, bound by a heavy blue cover sheet that bore the embossed seal of the state of Illinois. He did not toss it onto the table the way Harrison had thrown his pathetic check. He set it down with precision, pressing his hand flat against the cover page, commanding absolute attention. "Harrison, I strongly suggest you stop talking," Oliver said, his voice dropping into a resonant, authoritative register that made my father look like an amateur. "Anything you say from this moment forward will absolutely be used against you in a federal indictment. Now I am going to explain exactly how you managed to engineer your own incarceration, and you are going to sit there and listen." Oliver slid the stack of documents across the table until it rested perfectly centered between the non-disclosure agreement and the cashier's check. "What you are looking at is the certified recorded documentation for the Chicago Heritage Trust." Oliver began tapping the cover page with his index finger. "Exactly 2 years ago, my client Claire executed an irrevocable trust agreement. On that date, she legally transferred the title of the commercial property on Michigan Avenue out of her individual name and into the trust. She is the sole beneficiary and the sole managing trustee." Oliver paused, letting the legal reality of those words hang in the air. He wanted to make sure Harrison was absorbing the full impact of his catastrophic mistake. "Do you understand what an irrevocable trust means?" Harrison Oliver asked, his tone shifting from informative to interrogative. "It means that as of 24 months ago, Claire no longer owned that building as an individual entity. The trust owned it. And that brings us to the very precarious, very fatal legal position you have placed yourself in today." Oliver reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a single sheet of paper inside a clear plastic sleeve. It was a copy of the emergency medical power of attorney my parents had been holding on to for 4 years. "You relied on this document to execute your little real estate scheme." Oliver continued, holding the paper up so everyone at the table could see it. "A temporary emergency medical directive signed 4 years ago, a document that granted you the authority to act on behalf of Claire as an individual person in the event she was incapacitated. But Harrison, that is where your amateur-hour legal strategy fell completely apart." Oliver leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table, invading my father's space with the full weight of the law. "A power of attorney granted by an individual does not give you the legal authority to act on behalf of a trust," Oliver stated, articulating each syllable with devastating clarity. "You cannot sign away assets that belong to a separate legal entity. The moment Claire transferred that property into the irrevocable trust 2 years ago, the power of attorney you are holding became legally dead. It was void. It was completely useless for any real estate transaction involving that building." Harrison's face had drained of all color. The arrogant flush of his champagne toast was entirely gone, replaced by a sickly gray pallor. He stared at the trust documents on the table, his mouth opening and closing silently as his brain desperately tried to find a loophole in Oliver's airtight explanation. "You committed title fraud," Harrison Oliver said, stepping back and folding his arms. "You marched into a title company, presented a voided legal document, and fraudulently signed a deed transfer on a $12 million property you had absolutely no legal authority to sell. The escrow officer accepted it because you are her father, and people tend to trust distinguished-looking older men in expensive suits. But their negligence does not absolve you of the crime. You lied about your authorization, you forged a path through the title process, and you illegally authorized the sale of an asset that was protected by an irrevocable trust." The silence in the room was absolute. Even Savannah and Jamal had stopped breathing, finally realizing the catastrophic nature of the situation. They were not just facing a civil lawsuit, they were facing criminal charges. It is a bad situation. Harrison Oliver continued, his voice devoid of any sympathy. But unfortunately for you, title fraud is just the appetizer. The real problem, the problem that brought my friends from the federal government here tonight, is what you did with the money. Oliver gestured toward the two FBI agents standing silently near the door. When you executed that fraudulent sale, you accepted a wire transfer of $12 million from the purchasing corporation, Oliver explained, shifting into the prosecutor's role. You used a forged signature on a voided document to initiate a massive transfer of capital across state lines. And then, according to your own very loud, very public boasting just a few moments ago, you immediately began bouncing that stolen money through a series of offshore holding companies in Delaware, the British Virgin Islands, and the Caymans. Oliver picked up the cashier's check Harrison had offered me and held it between his fingers, inspecting it with disgust. And then you tried to bribe the victim with a fraction of her own stolen funds, Oliver added, dropping the check back onto the table. You tried to force her to sign a non-disclosure agreement to cover up your federal crimes. You engaged in extortion, blackmail, and systematic financial fraud. Oliver looked directly at my father, delivering the final crushing blow. You did not execute a brilliant business maneuver, Harrison. You committed federal wire fraud. You committed title fraud. You committed extortion. And you did it all leaving a massive, undeniable paper trail that leads directly back to your personal and corporate bank accounts. The sale is entirely fraudulent. The deed transfer is void. The property belongs to the trust, and you are sitting on $12 million of stolen federal funds. Harrison's chest heaved. He was a man accustomed to navigating treacherous financial waters, but he had never faced a tidal wave quite like this. He stared at Oliver, his mind racing through permutations, searching for any possible exit strategy. He had built his entire career on exploiting technicalities, and now a massive technicality was threatening to drag him into a federal penitentiary. The arrogance that usually defined him was heavily battered, but it was not entirely extinguished. He was not a man who surrendered easily, especially not to his own daughter. He slammed his hand onto the table, causing the silverware to jump. "It does not matter," Harrison shouted, his voice cracking with desperate, unhinged bravado. "It does not matter what kind of legal voodoo you pulled with that trust." He pointed a trembling finger at Oliver. "The transaction is complete." The escrow closed. The corporate buyers accepted the title, and more importantly, they wired the $12 million into my accounts. The funds cleared, Oliver. I have the cash, I possess the liquid assets. If there is a dispute over the title, that is a civil matter between Horizon Holdings and the trust. Let their corporate lawyers battle it out with you in court. They have more money than God. Good luck trying to get that deed back from them. In the meantime, the money is fully insulated offshore, and I am untouched. Harrison turned his frantic, wide-eyed glare toward the FBI agents, trying to project absolute, unshakable confidence. I am a sophisticated investor. I executed a commercial transaction in good faith. If the title company made a mistake, that is their liability, not mine. You cannot arrest me for a bureaucratic oversight. He looked at me, a feral, cornered look in his eyes. You think you are so clever, Claire. You think you trapped me. But all you did was hand over a very messy legal problem to a massive, aggressive corporation. Horizon Holdings will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. They will bury you. And while you are fighting them, Jamal and Savannah will be living in Malibu, and my accounts will be overflowing with their cash. You lost. Beatrice seized upon my father's desperate logic, her own panic, transforming back into vicious entitlement. Your father is right, she shrieked, clutching her diamond necklace as if it might physically shield her from the federal agents. The money is ours now. You cannot just take it back because you found a loophole. We made a deal. The buyer accepted the terms. Horizon Holdings bought the property fair and square. Jamal let out a loud, nervous laugh, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Exactly, he chimed in, leaning forward as if trying to reassert his imaginary dominance. The deal is closed. The funds are deployed. You can waive all the trust documents you want, Claire, but you cannot unring this bell. Horizon Holdings is not going to just hand the building back because you hired a fancy lawyer. They are going to crush you. I looked at the three of them, observing the sheer magnitude of their delusion. They were clinging to Horizon Holdings like a life raft, fully believing that this anonymous corporate monolith would serve as their ultimate protector. They thought they had successfully passed the legal liability onto a third party, insulating themselves from the consequences of their forgery and fraud. I let their frantic, desperate assertions echo through the room. I let them exhaust their pathetic defense mechanisms. Then I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the pristine white tablecloth. I looked directly into my father's eyes, holding his gaze with absolute, unyielding calm. "Do you know who owns Horizon Holdings, Dad?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Harrison blinked, clearly thrown by the question. "What?" he stammered, the bravado suddenly slipping. "I said, do you know who owns Horizon Holdings?" I repeated, leaning in a fraction closer. "Do you know who the principal shareholder is? Do you know who signed the purchase agreement for my property?" Harrison swallowed hard. The confidence that had just flared up in him began to rapidly evaporate, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "It is a corporate conglomerate. It is an investment group." I smiled. It was the same cold, calculating smile Oliver had given me when we first drafted the trust documents. "It is a shell company, Dad," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "It is a corporate entity registered in Delaware, specifically designed to mask the identity of its sole owner." The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the impending realization of what I was about to say. "I own Horizon Holdings," I stated, dropping the final devastating piece of the puzzle onto the table. "I am the sole shareholder. I am the CEO. I am the anonymous corporate buyer you have been boasting about all evening." The color drained from Harrison's face so completely he looked like a corpse. Beatrice let out a small, strangled gasp. Savannah clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. Jamal shrank back into his chair, physically retreating from the magnitude of the trap that had just snapped shut around them. I used the liquid capital generated by the Chicago Heritage Trust to fund Horizon Holdings. I explained, delivering the operational mechanics of my plan with the ruthless precision of an audit report. "When you listed the property, my broker submitted the anonymous cash offer. When you signed that fraudulent deed transfer, you were attempting to sell my property back to me. And when you accepted that $12 million wire transfer, you accepted funds directly from an entity that I completely control." Harrison was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving as his brain desperately tried to process the sheer scale of his defeat. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in the center of a minefield and he had already triggered the detonator. "You did not outsmart a massive faceless conglomerate, Dad," I continued, relentless in my execution. "You walked directly into a controlled environment that I built specifically for you. You initiated a wire transfer across state lines using a forged signature on a voided power of attorney, and you accepted $12 million of my money." I paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring that every single word registered with maximum impact. "You did not find a loophole," I concluded softly. "You handed me the murder weapon, complete with your fingerprints, a signed confession, and a very clear, very public money trail." The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against their chests. I watched my father's eyes dart wildly around the private dining room, searching for a conceptual emergency exit that simply did not exist. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands loosely in my lap. "I wanted to sell the building anyway," I stated, my voice echoing with clinical precision. Managing commercial real estate was becoming a tedious distraction from my actual career as a financial auditor. The trust had officially authorized a liquidation strategy months ago. But I knew that if I put the property on the open market legitimately, you would instantly try to interfere. You would file frivolous injunctions, claim mental incompetence, or try to bleed the estate with administrative legal disputes. I needed a clean break. I needed to liquidate the asset while simultaneously removing your toxic influence from my financial life forever. So I built Horizon Holdings. I continued laying out the architecture of my plan. I registered the shell corporation in Delaware to ensure absolute, impenetrable anonymity. Then I legally authorized my financial managers to transfer $12 million of liquid capital from the Chicago Heritage Trust directly into Horizon's operating accounts. Once the shell company was fully funded, I hired an aggressive corporate broker to approach you. I knew you were actively shopping my property on the black market using that voided power of attorney. I knew you were desperate for cash to fund Jamal's failing tech startup before his creditors forced him into bankruptcy. When my broker presented you with an anonymous all-cash offer for the exact maximum valuation of the building, you did not even bother to perform basic due diligence. You were so blinded by your own insatiable greed that you skipped every standard security protocol. You just saw a mountain of cash and sprinted blindly toward the edge of the cliff. Harrison's mouth opened and closed. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. "But it was your own money," he stammered, his voice weak, raspy, and trembling with denial. "You used your own money to buy your own building. There is no victim here, Claire. No one actually lost any capital. It is a closed loop. You cannot arrest me for a victimless financial transaction." Oliver laughed. It was a harsh, unforgiving sound that immediately shattered my father's pathetic legal defense. "You really do not understand federal law at all, do you?" Harrison Oliver asked, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "The FBI does not care about the origin of the capital. They care about the mechanism of the fraud." Oliver stepped closer to the table, pointing a sharp, accusing finger at my father. "When you walked into that title office, you presented a document you knew was obsolete to deliberately deceive a financial institution. You signed a binding legal contract swearing under penalty of perjury that you had the authority to sell an asset you did not own. That is title fraud. But the real masterpiece of your stupidity was the digital transfer of the funds. You instructed the escrow officer to wire $12 million across state borders into your personal holding accounts. By using an electronic communications network to execute a fraudulent scheme to obtain money, you committed federal wire fraud. Every single step of your brilliant business maneuver was a distinct, heavily penalized felony." Oliver turned his attention to Jamal, who was currently slumped in his chair, sweating profusely and staring blankly at the floor. "And let us not forget the brilliant tech CEO, Oliver," continued his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Jamal, you actively participated in this conspiracy. You knowingly received stolen funds. And less than an hour ago, right here at this dinner table, you wired a $2 million cash deposit from those illicit accounts across state lines to an escrow company in California. You did not just benefit from a crime, you actively engaged in money laundering. You took stolen federal funds and attempted to clean them through a high-end real estate transaction. That makes you a primary co-conspirator in a major federal indictment." Jamal let out a pathetic whimper, burying his face in his hands. Savannah stared at him in absolute horror, her dreams of a Malibu mansion and viral home tours instantly evaporating into the terrifying reality of federal prison sentences and seized assets. The lead FBI agent finally stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His gold shield and his physical presence commanded total submission. "Mr. Harrison," the agent said, his tone strictly professional and devoid of any emotion, "wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for each individual count. Money laundering carries similar penalties. You orchestrated a multi-million-dollar fraudulent scheme, utilized offshore accounts to hide illicit funds, and conspired with your family members to execute the theft. We have the forged deed, the wire transfer receipts, the tracking on the routing numbers to the Cayman Islands, and a highly detailed voluntary confession recorded right here in this restaurant by multiple federal witnesses." Beatrice let out a sharp, hysterical sob. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate realization that her high society life was over. "Claire, please," she begged, her voice trembling violently as she abandoned all her previous cruelty. "You cannot do this. We are your family. You cannot send your father to prison. We will give the money back. We will reverse the transfers right now. Jamal will cancel the Malibu house. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell the agents it was a private family dispute that we resolved tonight." I looked at my mother. I remembered her vicious threat just 20 minutes prior. I remembered her promising to destroy my career to call my managing partners and to fabricate an ethics complaint that would leave me blacklisted and working a cash register at a retail store. I looked at the diamond necklace she had bought to celebrate my financial ruin. I felt absolutely nothing for her. "It is no longer up to me, Mother," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You committed a crime against the United States government. The FBI does not drop federal felony charges just because you offer to return the stolen money after you get caught. And frankly, even if I possess the power to stop them, I would not lift a single finger to help you. You spent this entire evening bragging about my destruction. You tried to blackmail me with my career. You threw a $100,000 bribe in my face and told me I was dead to you. You made your choices with absolute unyielding malice. Now you get to experience the inevitable consequences." I looked down at the non-disclosure agreement resting on the floor where I had pushed it earlier. "You wanted a signed confession tonight?" I added, addressing Harrison one last time. "You wanted me to sign a document that bound me to silence. But you were so arrogant you failed to realize you were the one signing a confession all along. Every document you forged, every offshore account you opened, every wire transfer you initiated, it was all tracked, documented, and handed directly to the federal authorities. The federal trap did not just snap shut, Dad. It locked from the outside, and I am the only one holding the key." The psychological unraveling of a narcissist is not a quiet event. It is a violent, chaotic implosion, the catastrophic collapse of a false reality that can no longer sustain its own weight. The moment those final words left my mouth, Harrison physically broke. The impeccable posture that had defined his entire existence dissolved in a fraction of a second. His knees buckled slightly, and he grabbed the edge of the dining table to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpet. His face, previously flushed with the heat of arrogant victory and expensive champagne, turned a sickening, translucent shade of chalk white. He began to hyperventilate. His breath hitched in his throat, coming in shallow, ragged gasps that sounded like tearing paper. He clawed at the silk tie around his neck, suddenly desperate for oxygen in a room that felt entirely devoid of it. The terrifying reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence was crashing down on him, crushing the breath from his lungs. He was no longer the untouchable patriarch of a wealthy Chicago dynasty. He was just an old, desperate man staring down the barrel of a federal indictment, his legacy permanently reduced to a mugshot and a prison jumpsuit. Beatrice reacted with a frantic, manic denial. The high society matron who had just threatened to destroy my career with a single phone call completely lost her grip on sanity. She lunged forward, nearly knocking over her crystal water goblet, and reached out toward the lead FBI agent. She attempted to grab his arm, a desperate, hysterical gesture that the agent smoothly evaded with a stern, warning glare. "You have to listen to me," Beatrice pleaded, her voice cracking into a shrill, unrecognizable pitch. "My husband is a respected businessman. We are members of the Symphony Guild. We donate to charities. You cannot just come in here and treat us like common criminals. There has to be a fine we can pay. We can pay a penalty. Just tell us how much it is to make this go away. We can write a check right now." She was trying to bribe a federal agent in front of multiple witnesses, her brain completely unable to comprehend a situation that could not be solved with a checkbook or a country club connection. But the most spectacular disintegration came from Jamal. The moment he realized the sheer magnitude of the federal trap, the moment he understood that his $2 million wire transfer had officially designated him as a primary co-conspirator in a major money laundering operation, self-preservation kicked in with ruthless predatory instinct. He did not hesitate. He did not look at his wife. He instantly turned into a cornered rat, violently turning on the very people who had just handed him a stolen fortune. Jamal shot up from his chair so fast it tipped over backward, crashing loudly against the wood-paneled wall. He threw his hands into the air, backing away from the table, as if my parents had suddenly become radioactive. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this." Jamal screamed, his voice echoing frantically across the private dining room. His eyes were wide with sheer terror, darting between Oliver and the federal agents. I am an innocent bystander. I am a legitimate technology executive. Harrison lied to me. He told me the property sale was completely legal. He told me the power of attorney was valid and verified by his corporate lawyers. I never saw the original documents. I never spoke to the title company. They set me up. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Harrison, who was still gasping for air and clutching his chest. He manipulated me. Jamal yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He knew my startup was looking for legitimate venture capital, and he used my company to launder his stolen money. He is the mastermind. He and Beatrice orchestrated the entire fraud to steal from their own daughter. I am a victim of their deception. I will testify to everything. I will give you access to all my corporate accounts. Just look at the communication logs. I thought it was a clean investment. You cannot hold me responsible for the psychotic greed of my in-laws. Savannah stared at her husband in absolute paralyzed horror. The man who had been kissing her head and promising her a Malibu mansion just 10 minutes ago was now screaming at federal agents, desperately trying to throw her parents into a federal prison to save his own skin. The perfect, curated influencer marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. Jamal. What are you doing? Savannah shrieked, tears of genuine panic finally streaming down her face. Those are my parents. You cannot say those things about them. You knew exactly where that money came from. We celebrated it in the car on the way here. We picked out the house together. Shut up, Savannah, Jamal roared back at her, abandoning every ounce of the loving husband persona. He glared at her with pure, unadulterated venom. You are just as crazy as they are. You all sat around plotting how to steal from Claire, and you dragged my reputation into the mud with you. I am not going to federal prison because your father is a white-collar thief, and your mother is a sociopath. I am cooperating with the authorities. I am giving them everything they need to lock Harrison away forever. The narcissistic family unit, stripped of its power and its primary scapegoat, immediately began to cannibalize itself. Without me there to absorb their toxicity, without my inheritance to fuel their delusions of grandeur, they turned their vicious predatory instincts upon each other. It was a terrifying, mesmerizing spectacle of absolute moral bankruptcy. Harrison tried to speak, tried to defend himself against Jamal's vicious accusations, but his voice was nothing more than a weak, breathless wheeze. Beatrice spun around to scream at Jamal, calling him a pathetic, failing grifter who had leeched off her family for years, completely forgetting her attempts to bribe the federal agents just moments before. Savannah sobbed hysterically, caught in the crossfire between her treacherous husband and her criminal parents. I sat quietly watching the empire burn. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel a sudden urge to rescue them from the flames. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of arrogance, cruelty, and unbridled greed. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and a single breath of truth had brought the entire structure crashing down on their heads. They had meticulously dug their own graves, and now they were shoving each other into the dirt, desperate to survive the fallout of their own spectacular failure. The cacophony of betrayal echoing around the private dining room reached a fever pitch. Jamal was still shouting frantic accusations at my parents, desperately trying to construct a narrative where he was a naive victim of their master manipulation. Harrison was clutching his chest, his breath wheezing as the terrifying reality of federal prison crushed the last remnants of his arrogant facade. Beatrice was paralyzed, her eyes darting between the FBI agents and her treacherous son-in-law, completely incapable of formulating a defense that could save her high society reputation. Amidst this spectacular collapse, Savannah suddenly realized she was entirely exposed. The protective shield she had relied on her entire life, her father's financial bullying, her mother's vicious social maneuvering, and her husband's inflated tech persona, were completely obliterated. She was standing in the epicenter of a federal crime, and the only person holding the key to the exit was the sister she had spent the last hour ruthlessly mocking. Savannah scrambled out of her chair, her movements clumsy and frantic. The confident, entitled influencer who had sneered at my career and my lifestyle vanished, replaced by a terrified, desperate child. She practically threw herself across the plush carpet of the private dining room, closing the distance between us. Before I could fully process her sudden movement, she fell heavily onto her knees right in front of me. She reached out with trembling hands, her perfectly manicured fingers desperately grabbing the hem of my tailored navy skirt. She looked up at me, her face a messy, chaotic portrait of sheer terror. The tears streaming down her cheeks were no longer the manufactured theatrical drops she had used earlier to gain sympathy. They were raw, ugly tears of absolute panic. "Claire, please," Savannah sobbed, her voice cracking as she clutched the fabric of my skirt. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a mistake. We are sisters, Claire. We share the same blood. You cannot let them take my husband away. You cannot let them send Mom and Dad to federal prison. Please, I am begging you." She shook my skirt, trying to physically force me to acknowledge the familial bond she was desperately weaponizing. "Think about my future children," she wailed, her voice echoing shrilly in the tense atmosphere of the room. "Think about your nieces and nephews. You cannot let them grow up with their grandparents locked away in a penitentiary. You cannot let them grow up with a bankrupt father who is fighting federal money laundering charges. Please, Claire, have some mercy. Do it for the family. Do it because we are sisters." I looked down at her grasping hands. I looked at the diamond rings sparkling on her fingers purchased with money she never earned. I felt the tug on my skirt, a physical manifestation of her lifelong expectation that I would always absorb the impact of her failures. In the past, the mere mention of family loyalty would have triggered a deep, ingrained guilt within me. I would have folded under the weight of her tears, sacrificing my own well-being to maintain the fragile peace of our household. But the auditor inside me had already closed the books on this relationship. I felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical disgust. I took a deliberate, measured step backward. The movement was sharp enough to force her fingers to slip off the high-quality fabric of my suit. I physically severed her connection to me, reinforcing the impenetrable boundary I had built around my life. I stared down at her with absolute ice, offering no comfort, no sympathy, and no salvation. "You didn't remember we were sisters when you were shopping for Malibu mansions with my stolen future," I stated. My voice was quiet, but it carried the devastating, unyielding weight of absolute truth. Savannah flinched as if I had struck her. "You sat at this very table and mocked my single status." I continued, my words landing with ruthless precision. "You called me selfish for holding on to my own legal property. You laughed while Jamal bragged about dropping a $2 million cash deposit on a house you had absolutely no right to step foot in. You eagerly celebrated my financial execution because you thought my destruction would elevate your pathetic social media brand. You thought my pain was a perfectly acceptable exchange for your infinity pool and your custom marble countertops." Savannah shook her head violently, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. "I did not know the legal details," she gasped, desperately trying to rewrite her complicity. "I just trusted Dad. I did not know it was a federal felony. I swear, Claire, I thought it was just a standard business deal. Ignorance is not an alibi for malice." "Savannah," I fired back, shutting down her pathetic excuse instantly. "You knew exactly where that $12 million came from. You knew it was stolen directly from my inheritance. You did not care about the legal mechanics because you were too blinded by your own insatiable greed. Do not dare weaponize our bloodline now that you are facing the severe, inescapable consequences of your own actions. A real sister would have warned me. A real sister would have stopped the transaction. You are not my sister. You are a parasite who finally ran out of hosts." Savannah collapsed completely, her posture folding in on itself until she was hunched over the dining room carpet, weeping hysterically into her hands. It was the absolute dismantling of the golden child syndrome. For 29 years, she had navigated the world without ever facing a single boundary. Harrison and Beatrice had always shielded her from the fallout of her selfishness, continuously feeding her delusion that she was immune to accountability. Now the shield was permanently shattered. The reality of the real world had finally breached the walls of her privileged existence, and it was crushing her. And as for your hypothetical children, I added, my voice slicing through her loud, ragged sobs to deliver one final reality check. The absolute greatest gift I can give them is ensuring they do not grow up in a luxury compound funded by federal wire fraud. Perhaps growing up without a stolen silver spoon in their mouths will force them to develop the one crucial thing this entire family completely lacks: character. The FBI agents stood silently by the doors, their expressions stoic and watchful. They did not intervene, allowing the toxic family dynamic to completely resolve itself in the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. The shift in power was permanently cemented. I stood tall, the untouchable auditor who had engineered her own salvation. Savannah remained sobbing on the floor, a broken, empty shell finally forced to pay the devastating invoice she had spent her entire life running away from. I turned away from my sister, leaving her shivering on the floor of the private dining room, and directed my attention to the men in the dark windbreakers. The lead FBI agent gave a sharp, subtle nod to his partner. The educational portion of the evening was officially concluded. It was time for the tactical execution. The two agents moved with a swift, synchronized efficiency that instantly drained whatever residual defiance remained in the room. They bypassed the overturned chairs and the discarded extortion documents, converging directly on their primary targets. Harrison and Jamal were hauled to their feet. The lead agent grabbed my father by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming his chest against the polished wood of the dining table. Harrison gasped his cheek, pressing against the pristine white linen right next to his half-empty champagne flute. The agent pulled Harrison's arms behind his back, and the harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed like a gunshot. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent began, his voice a flat mechanical drone that sliced through my father's shattered ego. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Jamal did not go quietly. As the second agent grabbed his wrists, my brother-in-law began to thrash, his panic escalating into a pathetic physical struggle. "You cannot do this!" Jamal screamed, twisting his body to avoid the cuffs. "I am a tech founder. I have investors. I was manipulated. Get your hands off me!" The agent did not utter a single word of warning. He simply applied a precise, agonizing pressure to Jamal's shoulder joint, forcing him down to his knees right beside Savannah. The second pair of handcuffs clicked shut, locking Jamal's wrists together. The brilliant Silicon Valley visionary was reduced to a weeping, handcuffed criminal kneeling on a restaurant carpet. Beatrice completely lost her mind. The reality of seeing her husband treated like a common street criminal shattered the fragile remnants of her high society composure. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that tore through her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and humiliation. She lunged forward, her diamond necklace swinging wildly, and clawed at the back of the lead agent's windbreaker. "Let him go!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing into the main corridor of the restaurant. "Do you know who we are? I will call the governor. I will have your badge for this. We are respected members of this city." The agent released Harrison just long enough to turn and point a rigid warning finger directly at my mother's face. "Ma'am, if you touch me again, you will be placed under arrest for assaulting a federal officer and obstruction of justice." The agent barked, his eyes blazing with absolute authority. "Step back and remain silent, or you will be leaving this restaurant in handcuffs as well." Beatrice recoiled as if she had been struck by lightning. She stumbled backward, crashing into a serving cart and sending a stack of silver plates clattering to the floor. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, finally realizing that her country club connections and her expensive wardrobe held absolutely zero currency in the face of a federal indictment. She was powerless. As the agents hoisted Harrison back to his feet to begin the perp walk, my father managed to twist his neck to look at me one last time. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and desperate denial. "You think you won, Claire Harrison?" spat, his voice trembling with venom. "I still have the offshore accounts. The $12 million cleared. You can lock me up, but I will make sure you never see a single penny of that money again." Horizon Holdings paid the cash, and it is hidden where your lawyers can never touch it. I stepped directly into his line of sight, blocking his view of the exit. I looked at the defeated, handcuffed man who had spent 32 years underestimating my intelligence, and I delivered the final, fatal financial blow. "You really do not pay attention to anything I say, Dad," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am an auditor. I track anomalies for a living. I did not just build a trap to catch you stealing the deed. I built a financial net to catch the capital. The moment you initiated that wire transfer from Horizon Holdings to your domestic account, my legal team flagged the transaction with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The federal government tracked every single digital footprint you left." Harrison's eyes widened, the last drop of hope evaporating from his system. "Those offshore accounts in the Caymans," I continued, leaning in closer so he could hear every syllable of his ruin. "They were frozen by an international federal injunction 30 minutes before I walked into this restaurant. The $2 million cash deposit Jamal sent to California, seized under federal asset forfeiture laws. Every single dime you attempted to launder is currently being held in a secure government escrow account. By the end of the week, the entire $12 million will be seamlessly routed right back into the Chicago Heritage Trust. You have absolutely nothing. You are completely bankrupt." I stepped aside, gesturing politely toward the heavy oak doors. The agents pushed Harrison and Jamal forward, marching them out of the private dining room. Through the open doors, I could see the horrified faces of the restaurant patrons and the elite diners pointing and whispering as two prominent Chicago businessmen were paraded through the establishment in federal handcuffs. Beatrice stumbled blindly after them, weeping hysterically, entirely ignoring Savannah, who was still curled in a fetal position on the floor. I did not follow them. I stood in the quiet wreckage of the private dining room and turned to Oliver. The ruthless attorney packed the trust documents back into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut. He looked at me and offered a respectful, deferential nod. "A flawless audit," Claire Oliver said. I looked down at the floor one last time. Resting near the toe of my sensible shoe was the cashier's check for $100,000 and the draconian non-disclosure agreement my father had tried to use to silence me. I left them right there in the dirt, exactly where they belonged. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped onto the busy Chicago pavement. The night air was crisp, carrying the sharp, invigorating chill of Lake Michigan. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, clean air. For the first time in my entire life, I felt utterly, profoundly weightless. The suffocating pressure of my toxic family, the endless demands to fund their delusions, the constant belittling of my career, it was all permanently erased. I had protected my legacy. I had defended my grandfather's hard work. I was financially untouchable and completely unapologetically free. The most dangerous lie we are taught to believe is that sharing a bloodline automatically entitles people to your loyalty, your resources, and your peace of mind. It does not. Toxic family members will weaponize the concept of love to bleed you dry, expecting you to quietly absorb their abuse while they build empires on your sacrifices. You do not owe your future to people who view you as a disposable asset. Protecting yourself requires ruthless logic, impenetrable boundaries, and the absolute courage to walk away when the people who are supposed to protect you become the predators. Never let anyone convince you that securing your own independence makes you the villain. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is let the bridge burn and use the light from the flames to guide your way forward. If you have ever had to build a fortress to protect your life from the people who share your last name, I want to hear your story. Let me know how you established your boundaries in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about surviving manipulation, taking back your power, and rewriting your own absolute victory. The most profound lesson illuminated by Claire's ordeal is that sharing a bloodline does not automatically entitle anyone to your loyalty, your resources, or your peace of mind. Society frequently perpetuates the dangerous myth that family must be endlessly forgiven, pressuring victims to absorb toxic behavior in the name of keeping the peace. This story systematically dismantles that expectation. When relatives weaponize the concept of family merely as a manipulative tool for financial and emotional extraction, the healthiest and most necessary response is absolute clinical detachment. Claire's ultimate triumph was not born from dramatic screaming matches or tearful pleas for validation. Instead, it was meticulously engineered through patient preparation, exceptional emotional regulation, and an unyielding grip on factual reality. She recognized that fighting narcissistic greed requires logic, professional boundaries, and airtight documentation rather than futile appeals to a sense of morality her parents and sisters simply did not possess. By removing her desperate desire for their approval from the equation, she gained the clarity needed to anticipate their moves and construct a legally impenetrable fortress around her hard-earned life. True independence demands recognizing that you are the sole guardian of your own future. Toxic individuals will willingly bankrupt your finances and crush your spirit if it serves their personal narrative of success. Breaking free from this destructive cycle requires accepting the harsh truth of who these people truly are, mourning the supportive family you actually deserved, and ruthlessly enforcing the boundaries required to protect your peace. You owe your lifelong loyalty to those who actively nurture your growth, not to those who secretly scheme for your downfall. Share this reflection with someone who needs the courage to establish their own non-negotiable boundaries today.